History has a way of playing tricks on our memory. The stories we think we know about famous battles and wars often bear little resemblance to what actually happened. Today, we're going to unravel some of the most persistent myths about warfare throughout history, and what we discover might surprise you. Silence as the visual montage concludes. Let's start with one of the most famous battles ever fought, the Battle of Thermopylae. You've probably heard the tale. 300 brave Spartans stood alone against the mighty Persian army. It's a great story, but it's also completely wrong. While King Leonidas did lead 300 Spartans, they were actually joined by around 7,000 other Greek warriors. The real number of defenders was closer to 7,300, not just 300. And those famous words, "Come and take them." While Leonidas may have said something similar, the first recorded use of this phrase wasn't until centuries after the battle. But perhaps no period of warfare has more myths surrounding it than World War II. We've all heard that carrots help you see in the dark, a piece of propaganda so successful that people still believe it today. The British government promoted this story to hide their real secret: radar technology. They didn't want the Germans to know how their pilots were really spotting bombers at night, so they created the carrot myth as a cover story. Speaking of World War II, here's another surprising fact. The largest naval battle in history wasn't in either World War. It was actually the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944, where over 200,000 personnel were involved in a series of engagements spanning 100,000 square miles of sea and airspace. Yet despite its massive scale, it's rarely discussed in popular history. Now let's tackle one of the most persistent myths about medieval warfare. Knights in shining armor were so heavy they needed to be lifted onto their horses with cranes. This is completely false. A full suit of plate armor typically weighed between 45 to 55 pounds, distributed evenly across the body. Knights could run, jump, and mount horses unassisted. In fact, there are recordings of knights doing cartwheels in full armor to demonstrate their mobility. The American Civil War has its own share of misconceptions. Many believe it was fought primarily over slavery, while others claim it was purely about states' rights. The truth, as documented in the actual declarations of secession, shows it was both, specifically, the state's right to maintain slavery. Mississippi's declaration stated plainly, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery." Here's a startling fact about warfare that few people know. Most soldiers throughout history never actually fired their weapons at the enemy. Studies from World War II showed that only 15 to 20% of soldiers fired their weapons in combat. This revelation led to major changes in military training, and by the Vietnam War, that number had risen to 95%. The Cold War gives us another fascinating myth to debunk. Many people believe the space race was purely about scientific achievement and national pride. In reality, both the US and Soviet space programs were deeply intertwined with military objectives. The rockets that took astronauts to the moon were developed from military ballistic missile technology. One of the most persistent myths about modern warfare is that the Vietnam War was lost primarily in the jungle. In truth, the most decisive battles often took place in urban areas, and the Tet Offensive, which many consider the turning point of the war, was primarily an urban campaign. The jungle warfare narrative oversimplifies a complex conflict that was as much about politics and public opinion as it was about military engagement. Let's address another common misconception: the idea that wars are won primarily through superior technology. While technology plays a crucial role, history shows that logistics, the ability to supply and support armies, often determines the outcome of conflicts. Napoleon famously said, "An army marches on its stomach." The greatest army in the world is useless if it can't feed its soldiers or supply them with ammunition. Ancient warfare myths need debunking too. The popular image of Viking berserkers as mindless warriors wearing bear skins and fighting in an uncontrolled rage. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests Viking warriors were actually highly disciplined and well-organized. using sophisticated tactics and wearing proper armor. The berserker myth likely originated from a combination of propaganda and misinterpreted religious rituals. Here's something that might surprise you about World War I. Despite the image of endless trench warfare, the average soldier spent only about 10 days per month in the front lines. The rest of the time was spent rotating through support trenches, reserve positions, and rest areas. The myth of the decisive battle, the idea that wars are typically won or lost in a single massive engagement, persists in popular imagination. However, most wars throughout history have been won through attrition, strategic maneuvering, and the gradual erosion of the enemy's will and capability to fight. Modern warfare has its own myths too. Many believe that precision-guided weapons have made war surgical and civilian casualties rare. The reality is that civilian casualties in modern conflicts remain disturbingly high, often exceeding military casualties. Perhaps the most dangerous myth about warfare is that it's inevitable, that human beings are naturally predisposed to large-scale conflict. Anthropological evidence suggests otherwise. Many societies throughout history have lived without warfare, and modern research indicates that cooperation, not conflict, has been the primary driver of human progress. As we separate fact from fiction in military history, we gain a clearer understanding of not just how wars were fought, but why they occurred and what they truly cost. The myths we tell ourselves about warfare often serve to make it seem more noble, more necessary, or more controllable than it really is. The truth, while sometimes less dramatic than the myths, is invariably more important to understand. By examining these myths and facts about warfare, we don't just learn about history, we learn about ourselves and the stories we choose to tell. Perhaps that's the most valuable lesson of all, that the truth of warfare, in all its complexity, deserves to be understood rather than simplified into comfortable myths.